Welcome to the debate. Today, we are digging into what is, well, arguably the most distinctive pillar of Latter-day Saint theology, the eternal family. And we're not talking about it as, a social unit or some kind of cultural ideal. We're looking at a cosmology where the family is the fundamental structure of the entire universe.
It is a massive claim, and we're focusing on a pretty specific set of texts: the 1995 Proclamation to the World, President Nelson's talk Divine Love, one from Dallin A. Jokes called Love and Law, and then a couple of the Gospel Topics essays, specifically Mother in Heaven and Becoming Like God.
Right. And the central tension that we really need to get at today is this friction between what the texts call divine law and divine love. The material lays out this really rigorous ideal, heterosexual marriage, specific gender roles, and it says these are not just rules for a happy life, but ontological necessities for exaltation.
And that's the core question, isn't it? Does that rigid structure, that law, end up suffocating the very love it's supposed to represent? I'm going to be arguing that while the vision is grand, the texts actually create a system of exclusion. You have these profound silences, especially around the divine feminine, and a redefinition of love that makes it conditional, which ultimately creates a kind of spiritual caste system.
And I'll be taking the position that these texts present something that is coherent, it's optimistic, and it's actually necessary. I think the arguments from President Nelson and others suggest that law is just the methodology of love. The boundaries aren't there to exclude, they're the architectural blueprints for a specific destiny, which is becoming like God. You just can't build a cathedral with the blueprints for a cottage.
Okay, so let's look at those blueprints. Start with your position. Why is this family structure seen as an ontological necessity and not just, a social good?
Well, to really get this, you have to accept the premise from the proclamation and that Becoming Like God essay. The theology starts from the idea that human beings are literally the spiritual offspring of deity. And that just changes the stakes entirely. We're not just creations, like a rock or a tree. We are, in a sense, embryos of the divine. The proclamation says that gender is an essential characteristic of individual, premortal, mortal, and eternal identity and purpose.
And essential is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. It suggests gender isn't just a biological coin flip or a performance, but the core axiom of who you are.
Precisely. And because the ultimate goal is theosis, exaltation, living the life God lives, we have to emulate the structure of God's life. And since God is presented as a united man and woman, as heavenly parents, well, the only way to achieve that state is through the union of a man and a woman. It's not arbitrary. If God is a family, then you can't become God as a single person. And this is why President Nelson in that Divine Love talk makes such a sharp distinction between God's love and God's blessings.
Okay, let's pull on that thread, because that speech from President Nelson is, I think, where the theology starts to really bruise people. In Divine Love, he argues, and I'm quoting here, "The full flower of divine love and our greatest blessings from that love are conditional, predicated upon our obedience to eternal law."
He does. And I think he's right to do so.
But look at what that does to the listener. It fundamentally redefines the relationship between a parent and a child. When President Nelson says divine love is conditional, he's shifting the whole linguistic landscape. He's separating the feeling of love from the act of blessing. But for the average person, conditional love just sounds transactional. It sounds like an employer-employee contract. It suggests that my value is tied to my performance.
I think that's a misreading of the text, though. President Nelson is very explicit. He says divine love is infinite and universal. The Savior loves both saints and sinners. He's not saying God stops loving someone who is rebellious. He's saying God cannot bless rebellion. Think of it like a doctor. A doctor can care deeply for a patient, love them. But if that patient refuses to take the medicine, the doctor can't force the blessing of health on them. The law is the prescription.
The prescription, though, in this theology, involves factors that are often outside a person's control, especially when it comes to family formation. And this leads right to the massive silence in the room. Mother in Heaven. You claim the goal is to become like God and that gender is essential. For men, the path is clear. you look to the Father and the Son. But for women?
The doctrine is very clear that she exists.
But existing isn't the same as being engaged with. The Mother in Heaven essay itself admits we have limited knowledge, and it explicitly confirms that Latter-day Saints, while they do not pray to Heavenly Mother, the text says we follow Christ's pattern of praying to the Father. But just think about the implication there. If I'm a woman, and my essential identity is female, and my destiny is to become a goddess, I have no prototype to speak to. I have no scriptural account of her words, her actions, nothing.
We know she's a co-creator,
We know she's a parent.
but we're effectively forbidden from forming a relationship with her. It creates an ideal family where the mother is present in theory, but completely absent in practice. The eternal family becomes partially invisible. I mean, how can you have a theology of the family where the children are only allowed to speak to their dad?
I disagree that she's invisible. The doctrine asserts her existence and her divinity, which is, miles ahead of traditional Christianity that usually sees God as exclusively male or genderless. But I do want to circle back to your point about the transaction. You called the conditionality of blessings transactional.
I did, yeah. I would argue that the law isn't a transaction. It's a description of reality. It's like physics. You can't touch a hot stove and not get burned, no matter how much your mother loves you. President Nelson is trying to save people from this neutered interpretation of love, this idea that God is love means God affirms everything I do. He's arguing that true love desires the growth of the beloved. If God just granted exaltation regardless of our behavior, he would be stripping us of our agency. As Dallin H. Oaks puts it in his talk, mercy cannot rob justice.
I understand the logic of mercy cannot rob justice. It's a classic legalistic framework. But look at the emotional fallout. Elder Oaks, in that same address, spends a good amount of time justifying the wrath of God. He asks, how are anger and wrath evidence of his love? And he answers that God loves us enough to correct us.
Which is a pretty standard definition of parental love. If I see my child playing in traffic, I don't just smile and say, "Oh, I validate your journey." I scream, "Get out of the road." That scream is love.
But when you combine wrath and conditional blessings and these really high-stakes requirements, you create a theology that's driven by anxiety. If the full flower of love is only available to those who walk this tightrope of obedience, then fear becomes a primary motivator. Perfect love casteth out fear, but this theology seems to reinstate it. The law becomes a source of stress, not safety. You're describing a God who is constantly auditing our books to see if we've earned the payout.
The texts describe commandments not as these arbitrary hoops, but as guardrails. The proclamation and the law of chastity, for example, are designed to protect the sacred powers of procreation. If you believe the premise that creating life is a godlike power, then the strict regulation of that power is the ultimate act of love. It protects us from misusing it. It's not about restricting pleasure, it's about preserving potential.
Preserving potential for whom, though? And this brings us to the second major point of friction: identity and gender. You mentioned earlier that gender is essential. David A. Bednar takes this much, much further in his talk, Marriage is Essential to His Eternal Plan.
Yes, he does. He argues that the natures of male and female spirits complete and perfect each other. He's implying that men and women are different by design, and that they're intended to progress together because they have these different spiritual capacities.
He says, and I'm quoting, "The man completes and perfects the woman, and the woman completes and perfects the man." It sounds romantic, but strictly speaking, it's functionalism. It implies that a single person is inherently incomplete, spiritually half-formed.
In the context of exaltation, yes, the text is clear on that. You can be saved as an individual, you can only be exalted as a couple. This goes right back to the ontology. If God is a unified pair, a single being cannot legally or physically be God in the full sense. It's not a punishment, it's a definition. A single wing can't fly, no matter how perfect its feathers are.
But this complete reliance on the unified pair model, it collapses when you actually look at the female half of the prototype. The Mother in Heaven essay, it acknowledges she exists, but that's really the extent of it. Bednar argues we need both genders to be perfected. Yet the liturgy, the prayers, the worship, the focus, it's all almost exclusively male.
The essay does clarify that this is to protect the sanctity of her name and to follow Christ's example.
That is the apologetic response, yes. We don't talk about her to protect her from disrespect. But we disrespect the father constantly in pop culture and casual swearing, yet we still pray to him. The result is that the proclamation tells a woman her identity is eternal, but she can't speak to her eternal mother. She can't study her eternal mother's words. She's asked to model her essential female identity on a father and a son. That is a massive cognitive dissonance. It suggests that in the eternities, the female role is to be revered but silent. That's a very difficult ideal to sell to a modern woman who's seeking spiritual agency.
I think you're stripping the doctrine of its power by focusing on the lack of detail. The structure is what matters. The very knowledge that she exists changes the entire Christian landscape. No other major Christian tradition offers a divine feminine at all. This theology says she is there, she is equal, she is a parent. The fact that we don't have her biography doesn't negate the power of knowing we're part of a two-parent eternal family. It creates a space for women that just doesn't exist anywhere else in Christianity.
It creates a space, but it leaves it unfurnished. It's a house with no furniture, no pictures on the wall, and the door is locked. And this brings us to the third point, this tension between the high ideal and the messy real.
You mean accessibility?
I do. The texts paint this picture of the nuclear family as the only vehicle for exaltation. But look at Elder Neil L. Anderson's talk, The Eye of Faith. He explicitly addresses those who do not fit neatly inside the proclamation. He mentions divorce, singleness, and specifically same-sex attraction.
And he treats them with great compassion.
He tells the story of a friend with same-sex attraction who chooses not to keep the law of chastity in the world in which we live. And he praises the friend for his celibacy and noble service. But think about what's actually being asked there. This man is required to live in a state of suspended animation when it comes to the core purpose of the theology, family creation, until he dies. He's told family is the order of heaven, but he's barred from participating on earth if he wants to stay in good standing.
But that's a temporal view of an eternal problem. This is where the doctrine of eternal progression is absolutely key. Elder Oaks, in Truth in the Plan, emphasizes that the plan covers eternity, not just this blip of mortality. The text implies that those who are faithful but lack opportunity, whether it's due to death, lack of a partner, or same-sex attraction, they will not be denied any blessing in the world to come.
That is the waiting room theology. Suffer now, rejoice later. It treats this life as a throwaway phase for anyone who doesn't fit the mold.
It's not a throwaway phase. It's a testing ground. It's a theology of trust. If you believe God is just, you have to trust him to fix the inequalities of mortality. You don't dismantle the eternal law just to make the waiting room more comfortable. As Oak said, the love of God does not supersede his laws. You can't just change the geometry of heaven to accommodate the confusion on earth. If a triangle is defined as having 3 sides, you can't draw a circle and call it a triangle just to be inclusive.
But the rhetoric isn't just wait and see. It's active pressure. Look at Julie B. Beck's address, Teaching the Doctrine of the Family. She frames family formation as a faith-based work. She warns that the rising generation sees it as a selection process instead of a duty. She says bearing children is a faith-based work.
She's elevating the mundane. She's telling mothers that changing diapers isn't drudgery. It is divinity. She's trying to combat the cultural devaluation of parenting. She's saying that the nursery is a laboratory for godhood.
She is, but she's also framing the failure to form a family as a spiritual failure. If bearing children is faith-based work, then the woman who can't bear children or the man who can't find a wife feels a deficit of faith. It internalizes circumstance as sin. When Anderson says we need an eye of faith to bridge these gaps, he's admitting that the gap is painful. My argument is that for many, that gap is just too wide to bridge. The ideal becomes a bludgeon. It just beats people down for not having what they can't grasp.
And I would argue that the ideal is a compass. A compass points north. It doesn't scream at you if you're in the south. It just tells you which way north is. If we remove the ideal, if we say any family structure is valid for exaltation, we lose the map entirely. We lose the definition of God. The rigor of the law is what gives the blessings their value. The high-demand nature of the theology is what makes the reward, becoming like God, even plausible. A participation trophy doesn't make you an Olympian.
So we're left with a choice between clarity and compassion?
Now,
I think it's between short-term comfort and eternal destiny. The advocate position is that the source material presents a difficult path because the destination is impossible to reach any other way. The strictness of the law, chastity, marriage, covenants, that's the necessary friction to polish a human soul into a divine one. The proclamation isn't just a list of rules, it's a description of how the universe actually works.
And the disinterposition is that the source material presents a path so narrow and so riddled with silence about the female divine that it risks leaving the majority of humanity behind. When divine love is conditional and the mother is silent, the eternal family feels less like a universal promise and more like a gated community, where the gatekeeper is checking credentials that, frankly, many people just weren't issued in this life.
I think we have to give the Becoming Like God essay its due here, though. It explicitly rejects that old caricature that we all get our own planet to rule over like it's a sci-fi movie. It frames exaltation as entering the family business of God. It's focused on relationships.
It does reject the planet caricature, yes, but it just doubles down on the relationship structure. It says we become heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. But again, the essay emphasizes this is a family affair. So my critique remains. If the family business requires a husband and wife, and the CEO of the company, God, is a husband and wife, but we're only allowed to acknowledge the husband, then the corporate culture is fundamentally broken for the female employees.
I think corporate culture is a pretty cynical way to view a theology of divine kinship. The text frames it as a plan of happiness.
For those who fit the plan, for those who don't, it's a plan of patience.
And perhaps patience is part of the curriculum of godhood.
That's easy to say when you fit the mold. It's much harder to hear when you're the one being asked to wait.
Fair enough. However, I think both sides of this have to concede that the texts are remarkably consistent in their core claim. Family is not just how we live, it's why we exist. And that moves the whole conversation from sociology to theology.
On that we agree. The stakes are infinite. Whether that why is inspiringly purposeful or restrictively exclusive, well, that's for the listener to decide.